We got reports as far back as last week that the CIPC had a data breach, and we've also seen confirmations or reports rather from a couple of media outlets that this breach has been going on quite extensively. I'm joined on the line by the head of consulting at Armata, Richard Frost, to take a look at this CIPC breach and potentially understand what its implications could be for us. Good evening, Richard. Thanks so much for taking the time. Let's start with a summary of the hack that's taken place or the breach that's taken place, the potential consequences around that, especially if we're looking at things like fraud risks.
Hi, Jimmy. Yeah, good evening, and thank you for having me. I think just as a way of starting, the extent of the breach has obviously been sort of released to the media so that people are aware of it. But the full extent of it and what exactly was stolen is probably still a little bit in the dark. And I think they themselves are probably still trying to gather exactly what kind of information was breached. I know that they claim, a lot of the information on their site is publicly accessible, but there are some things that obviously the CIPC or the CIPC, should have in the background that would not be public information. If that information has been taken, then there's probably more far-reaching consequences, especially from fraudulent transactions that could occur from that data.
Richard, let's look at, we'll come to the fraudulent transactions in a second. Let's look at the breach itself and the very little communication or lack of visibility, rather, around the extent to which the breach has affected us. I mean, for individuals that have companies registered with the CIPC, which is everybody that has a company registered in South Africa, how serious is this? What information is potentially here? What vulnerabilities are we looking at? There's been very little that's been said around all of that.
Yeah, so again, I think, there's company registration information, but there's also things like trademarks and other information like intellectual property that's been held there, like patents. So again, we don't know the full extent of what information was gathered. But you can understand as well, even though it is publicly available, there's information about the company directors, who's got shares in the business. And there's also ID information, email addresses, contact numbers for those directors that would now be accessible by the threat actors. Coupled to that, the fact that companies need to pay, fees that would require credit card information, which could be stored as well. If that information was also leaked, then obviously credit card information would have been stolen as well. That information could be used to create fake accounts with certain suppliers. A good example in the IT space, we obviously have credits with a lot of our suppliers. And if somebody were to take, for example, our company information and utilize that to create a fake account at one of the vendors, they could purchase information and have it delivered using genuine company information, but using, fake credentials to get that. Tying that up with maybe stolen IDs, fake IDs, you could quite easily fake the fact that you are the director in the company and actually create those credit facilities with organizations using fake CIPC information.
Richard, let's look at the need for vigilance. Now, the hack has obviously prompted us as individuals, as those that get involved in these sorts of things, to better protect yourself against cyber attacks. Let's look at the alerts or the systems or whatever needs to be put in place at the moment for companies to be able to assess their exposure or assess their threat levels, because different companies might not know at the moment whether their information has been leaked or not and what type of information. Some people if this has been going on since 2021, clearly the companies have bigger objectives or a long-term objective, and that long-term objective might not be visible from day one. How do we navigate that? How do we constantly just be prepared as individuals, but also what can be done to mitigate these in future?
Yeah, so I think from what's happened with the information that's been stolen, to understand the full extent of what is possible, it's too early to tell. But I think companies need to just be vigilant. Keep checking your credit records to see if people are, creating fake accounts in your name, because those will obviously be picked up in TransUnion and Experian. Keep checking to see if you're receiving any weird transactions by email at, request for payment or that kind of information, and just stay vigilant around those with the information that's out there. I think in addition to that, companies are facing a battle with fighting cybercrime and the fact that it's continuously evolving. If you look at the systems we had in place even 5 years ago, they're probably not efficient to protect against the kind of cyber breaches that we're having now. With the use of AI that's coming into it, I mean, the simple thing of you can write a hacking script with collaborative efforts with ChatGPT. These are things that weren't available to hackers 2-3 years ago. And the systems that we have in place, today, if it's more than 5-10 years old, might not be able to combat against some of these new threats, especially some of the zero-day threats that are out there. So I think it's just continuously making sure that you are staying up to speed with the technology and making sure that you're not falling too far behind the curve. And then, making sure that you have all the contingencies in place that when you do have a breach, you can contain it quickly, you can minimize the amount of data that's stolen. And also make sure that you know that the breach has occurred. Sometimes malware can sit in your environment for 180 days without being known, stealing the data, and only once it actually encrypts a person's machine do they actually realize there's been a breach.
Richard, how do we apply this to organizations? Now, the CIPC is not the first organization to be breached from a data perspective. We've seen organizations like Experian also going through data breaches. The data breaches, on average, cost the South African financial sector around 73 million rand. So obviously this is a significant amount, but it is something that, as you mentioned, speaks to cybercrime and the need to protect against that. What can companies be doing, not just companies listed or registered with the CIPC, but organizations like the CIPC, organizations like government organizations that are seemingly becoming more and more susceptible to these, or even private organizations? We know banks are also the targets of these sorts of hacks. What do organizations do to protect themselves?
Yeah, I think the focus around, what we do to protect ourselves is shifted. With, POPIA coming to effect and the regulators starting to become more powerful in regulating, controlling, and fining or imprisoning people around this. People need to be more concerned about personal information that they store. In the past, it used to be I had ransomware, I got somebody in to come and help me, or I paid the ransom to actually get the encryption. These days, when we respond to a breach, customers are more interested in, was there a data exfiltration? Was my data leaked online? And that's more concerning because there's far-reaching consequences on data breaches, probably worse than even your server being encrypted. There's reputational damage. There's the regulator that can come after you with a fine. There's customers that can start taking legal action because you weren't protecting, their information. There's a lot more at stake losing a customer's data these days than there was maybe a few years ago. So again, it's just making sure that you focus on protecting your data. Your data is accessible either via a user's machine or on the server itself. So they need to kind of focus where the data is resting, make sure that you're protected there and how people access that data. Another big problem that we have is third-party risk. So if you look at some of the larger organizations that have been breached, you probably find that 90% of those attacks occurred from a small organization that was trusted, that had been breached before, and the threat actors used access with the third party to get into the larger organization.
Well, hopefully the data points that do come out help us navigate this a little better. And as we find out more and more about the breach, hopefully we get to better protecting ourselves and understanding how this affects us all. Thanks so much, Richard, for those insights. That's Richard Frost, Head of Consulting at Armata, joining me to take a look at the CIPC's data breach and what this potentially means for us.
The Property Pod.